which is a debate on motion 18902 in the name of Miles Briggs on mismanagement of NHS construction projects. I would invite members who wish to speak in this debate to press their request to speak buttons, and I call on Miles Briggs to speak to and move the motion.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Patients, families and NHS staff need to have the confidence that the hospital environment they are being cared for and working in is safe. Now, the ongoing concerns and issues at the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People in Edinburgh and the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital in Glasgow have undermined public confidence, and that should concern us all. And I want to start today's debate by paying tribute to all those who work in our NHS, as well as the parents and families who have continued to speak out and seek answers from management and ministers over hospital safety concerns. I'm sorry to say that in many cases their concerns and questions have been dismissed. Presiding Officer, we need to have a transparent and open NHS in Scotland, where these real concerns are listened to and acted upon, and I'm sorry to say that has not been the case to date. As a Member of Parliament for Edinburgh and Lothian, I know just how desperately communities I represent here in the capital and across the east of Scotland need the new Sick Kids Hospital. That is why we have seen such anger from families and NHS staff on what should have been a much celebrated, state-of-the-art new hospital repeatedly delayed and not built to standard. A hospital now not due to open until next autumn, almost a decade since it was first promised. But it has not just been the sick kids here in Edinburgh where we have seen ongoing problems. Glasgow's Queen Elizabeth Hospital has suffered a catalogue of serious issues. And in Aberdeen just this week, we saw a review being announced into the cost and design of the new Baird Family Hospital and Anchor Cancer Centre. From Edinburgh to Glasgow to Aberdeen, we have seen the mismanagement of major hospital infrastructure projects across NHS Scotland, running over budget, behind schedule and with serious patient safety concerns. Now, the Cabinet Secretary and I are in agreement. Patient safety must always come first. That is why I want to use this debate today to ask the Cabinet Secretary about the here and now. I've received a number of communications from constituents and NHS staff raising concerns with me regarding the condition of the Department for Clinical Neurosciences at the Western and the Old Sick Kids Hospital here in Edinburgh. I've written to the Cabinet Secretary to raise these specific concerns directly, and I believe it's important we see ministers take action to reassure patients and investigate the standards of both medical equipment and the buildings currently being used at these NHS sites. NHS Lothian has been escalated to level 4, with the Scottish Government taking a directive role now in the operation of the board, assessing risk around delivery, quality and safety. So I'd therefore like to seek assurance and clarity over patient safety and inspection of the DCN and the Old Sick Kids Hospital, given that the whole hospital is now expected to remain in use for the next year and potentially beyond. Health Improvement Scotland last inspected the hospital in September of 2018. So will the Cabinet Secretary confirm today that she'll instruct Health Improvement Scotland to undertake an urgent inspection to investigate the concerns which I've highlighted to her? Yes.
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I just confirm that I will exactly do that? And in terms of the concerns that have been raised, I look forward to receiving your letter. I am visiting both the Sheens and the DCN site on Monday with the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Exec of NHS to meet groups of staff. They will have that opportunity to raise concerns, but we will also address the ones that you've raised.
I welcome that. And, Presiding Officer, above all, throughout this period, we must remember those at the heart of the problems which we've seen. Families and NHS staff with children often with compromised immune systems. And I've met with the families who have lost children. Cabinet Secretary, patients, families and NHS staff are beyond angry. They have had enough of and want to see real leadership to get these projects completed and the ongoing safety issues actually addressed. Now, I welcome the establishment of the new national body announced in the programme of government, which will have an oversight now of these major infrastructure project developments in the future. But we need to see real progress now to get this organisation established and working and for its powers to be outlined and concrete. That's why today I've called on ministers to confirm within the next week that there are no further delays or issues with ongoing projects and also to have a published remit for the new national body by December. Presiding Officer, I also welcome yesterday's U-turn by the Cabinet Secretary for an announcement of a public inquiry. It's worth reflecting, and Parliament to reflect, on what the Cabinet Secretary said last week, and I quote, "I do not see the difference a public inquiry would make." Cabinet Secretary, the public inquiry must make a difference. For the public to have confidence in that inquiry, and for the public across Scotland to have confidence in that inquiry, we must look at all aspects of what has gone wrong over the last 12 years. The inquiry needs to consider the role of the Scottish Government has had over this sorry period and what early warnings may have been missed by ministers. That is why we cannot support the Cabinet Secretary's amendment today, which already looks to limit the scope of the inquiry before that work has even started. Presiding Officer, the Cabinet Secretary should be in no doubt that this is the last chance to show she has the leadership needed to turn this unacceptable situation around. 3 major projects in Scotland's 3 largest cities have been beset with problems. I'm hugely disappointed and sorry that our great National Health Service in Scotland finds itself in this situation. So let me make it clear to the Cabinet Secretary. Scottish Conservatives will never stop holding this government to account for what we have seen. The SNP has been sole charge of our health service for 12 years now. It is SNP ministers who are ultimately responsible, and it is SNP ministers who must take responsibility for these failures. I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary, Jean Freeman, to speak to and move the amendment in her name.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to speak in this debate and move the Government amendment in my name. With members across this chamber, I share the concerns highlighted by the ongoing infrastructure issues at Queen Elizabeth University Hospital campus in Glasgow and those highlighted in the delay to occupying the new Royal Hospital for Children and Young People in Edinburgh and the Department of Clinical Neurosciences. The safety and well-being of all patients and their families is my priority and must be the primary consideration in all NHS construction projects. Last week, I outlined how the reports I commissioned from KPMG and NSS into the Edinburgh project raised a number of issues that need to be resolved before patients can safely be cared for at the new site. Our Senior Programme Director, Mary Morgan, began work on Monday to deliver on the plan I set out to deliver a safe and compliant site for the new Edinburgh Children's Hospital and to ensure that the necessary work is undertaken at the current sites at Sheens and Western General to reinforce the safe delivery of services over the coming months. On Monday, as I've said, I will again meet groups of staff at both sites and will continue to ensure that the Partnership Forum remains up to date. The focus will remain on resolving the current issues and completing the work on DCN by spring next year and the Children's Hospital by next autumn, and I will keep members updated as we make progress. At the Queen Elizabeth, we continue to monitor the situation closely via Health Protection Scotland, and we monitor how Greater Glasgow and Clyde are meeting our expectations to continually review the control measures in place for infection prevention and that these measures are continually reviewed throughout the paediatric hemato-oncology patient pathway. I've spoken on more than one occasion to the Chair of the Board, and our Chief Nursing Officer and her team continue to engage directly with senior staff in the Board. I've written today to those families of patients in the oncology service at Glasgow Children's Hospital who have contacted me to make arrangements that suit them for the meeting or meetings that I will have with them to hear their concerns directly. The work of the independent review continues, and members have recently been updated on progress as the review moves from reviewing written evidence to hearing directly from key personnel. Presiding Officer, as I said last week, there have been new infrastructure builds right across our NHS which have been delivered on time, on budget and in compliance. It is important to be clear on that, in fairness to all those who have worked so hard to achieve those results. But over recent days, families of children receiving care at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital campus have made clear that, notwithstanding the high quality of care they are receiving, they remain concerned about the safety of the building and they want the additional assurance that would be provided by a public inquiry. I said last week that we needed to ensure that past problems and mistakes are not repeated, and we need to ensure that families, patients and the wider public are assured that we understand what has gone wrong and are taking the necessary steps to ensure mistakes aren't repeated. So my amendment sets out clearly that I will establish a public inquiry under the Inquiries Act.
Yeah. Scroll Hamilton.
I'm very grateful for the Cabinet Secretary giving way. At this time, the Liberal Democrats are minded to support the Government's amendment tonight, but could she confirm, given that Miles Briggs suggested the amendment limits the scope of a public inquiry, that this inquiry will be allowed to go where the evidence takes it?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I can confirm that, and I'm coming to it. The inquiry will be on a statutory basis with all the powers that brings. It will consider both the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital campus and the Royal Hospital for Children and Young People in Edinburgh, determine how deficiencies in ventilations and other key building systems occurred, determine who was involved when, at what stage, and make recommendations on the steps we need to take to ensure past mistakes are not repeated in future infrastructure projects. I will return to the Chamber to advise on who will lead the inquiry, its full remit, and the timetable as soon as these details are finalised. But let me say, the inquiry remit will be informed by the views of the person who leads it, and given its statutory nature, I would expect that that individual will at least have a legal background. I expect, though, yes?
Jeremy Balfour.
I'm grateful to the Cabinet Secretary. Having lived through the tram inquiry here in Edinburgh, which is still to report, I appreciate she said she'd come back with a timescale. How long, roughly, does she think this inquiry will take, and when will we hear its recommendations?
Cabinet Secretary.
It's not sensible or possible for me to answer that at this point. I completely understand the need that you have, as I do, to hear what it's got to say and what it finds, but at the same time, it's an independent inquiry on a statutory basis, and whoever is chairing and leading that inquiry has to have a key role in determining the full scope that it has and how it will go about its work. But I expect the current independent review at Queen Elizabeth and the reports from KPMG and NHS that I published last week to provide important information to it, and the inquiry's conclusions and recommendations will further inform the work of the new national body that we are moving to set up. The new national body will have responsibility for oversight of the design, construction and maintenance of major infrastructure developments within NHS Scotland, ensuring the embedding of a focus on patient safety and a clear understanding of the interrelationship between building design and effective infection prevention and control. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, my focus is threefold: making sure that all the steps necessary are taken to ensure the safe delivery of the new hospital in Lothian, the safe delivery of care at the Queen Elizabeth campus, establishing a new body to oversee our coming infrastructure build, applying best practice in every aspect, and providing the necessary independent assurance to patients, families and the public through the work of the statutory public inquiry. I move the amendment in my name and urge members to give it their support.
Thank you. I now call Monica Lennon to speak to and move the amendment. Ms Lennon, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am grateful to Miles Briggs for bringing his motion to the Chamber for debate today. On these benches, we share his deep concerns about the mismanagement of NHS hospital construction projects and the resulting consequences for patients and staff. Scottish Labour has been campaigning loudly for an independent public inquiry into Scotland's hospital crisis because we share the concerns of patients, their families and our hard-working NHS staff. In Edinburgh, the shiny new Royal Hospital for Children and Young People is lying empty because it is not safe for patients. And in Glasgow, the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital has been rocked by one crisis after another. The Crown Office is currently investigating the deaths of patients who contracted infections at the hospital. And in Glasgow still, the purpose-built Royal Children's Hospital campus is closed because of fears about water safety after children contracted infections. And the adult ward that was supposed to be a safe haven for these children is now closed to new admissions because of infection risk. So we have children with cancer being temporarily diverted, to use the language of NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde. An expression which is fine about if you're talking about cars being rerouted due to roadworks, but we are talking about toddlers and young people with cancer, and I, for one, find it rather insensitive. Some of these children face a 300-mile round trip to Grampian for cancer treatment, far from home, from their family and friends. The Children's Hospital in Edinburgh and the Queen Elizabeth complex in Glasgow were both built by the same contractor, Multiplex. And some of the problems that have been uncovered are very similar, which is another reason why we have campaigned for a public inquiry. Thankfully, the opening of the Edinburgh Hospital was blocked in the nick of time, and I'm sure we are all relieved because who knows what might have happened if children had moved across. But children and young people in Lothian badly need the new hospital because, as this chamber has heard many times before, the current building is old and not fit for purpose. They have waited several years for the new building, which was already long overdue. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what investment will be made available to upgrade the current hospital and make it more comfortable for patients, and especially around accident and emergency, which we know just isn't fit for purpose? When will that work get underway, Cabinet Secretary? And back to the Queen Elizabeth in Glasgow, Scotland's biggest hospital. When we add up the hospital in Edinburgh with the Queen Elizabeth, we're talking about almost £1 billion of investment. But in reality, because of the mistakes and the missed opportunities that are being uncovered, it's all going to cost much, much more. We need to know how we've ended up with a badly... we need to know why we've ended up with hospitals that are just not safe. It's shocking that the deficiencies in the hospital's ventilation in Edinburgh were only identified 100 hours before the facility was due to open. We're talking about a hospital for some of Scotland's sickest children. We've heard reports that have been commissioned that talk about human error, but we need to know, the public need to know who is responsible and how could any of this happen. In Glasgow, the problems at the flagship hospital and purpose-built children's hospital have only come to light once patients have moved in, and tragically, some patients have died after contracting infections. There will be plenty of time to interrogate the pipes, the drains, the drawings and the contracts, but I want to talk today about a patient, Stevie Jo Kirkpatrick, who's from Dumfries. She is 15, she has leukaemia, and she's been a patient at the Queen Elizabeth for several years. I spoke to her mum, Anne-Marie, on the phone earlier today, and I know that the Cabinet Secretary has written to the family and others. Stevie Jo was admitted to the adult ward at the Queen Elizabeth in November and remained there until February. Because the children's hospital next door is closed on safety grounds, her parents had no access to family facilities. During that 4-month period, the family racked up a bill of £3,000 in travel, food and accommodation. There is no social space for teenagers in the adult ward, and Stevie Jo is stuck in her room, is isolated and is anxious. Anne-Marie, her mum, told me, there are no facilities for us. Some days parents don't eat because we are stuck in a room with very sick children. There is nowhere to prepare a meal, not even a microwave. There is no peace and quiet if you just need 5 minutes to yourself. We just want answers, and no one is telling us if our children are safe. That is why we need a public inquiry. It's long overdue. So today, I am willing, Scottish Labour will support the Scottish Government's amendment, because we want to believe the Cabinet Secretary that you are sincere and serious. We have to sort this out. It is a disgrace. I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you. I call Alison Johnson to open for the Green Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. New state-of-the-art hospitals to look after Scotland's people, young and old, should rightly be a source of national pride. But sadly, here we are this afternoon debating the mismanagement of NHS construction projects. I thank the Conservatives for providing this opportunity to do so, because it's crystal clear we can't continue like this. The impact on the health of patients who deserve and require the best of care is of huge concern, as are the demands we place on those who work in our National Health Service. Because when we can't get basics like ventilation and drainage right in our hospitals of all places, something has gone horribly wrong. A local mum told me of her visit to the sick kids last month, on the Sheen site, of course. A wall had been signed by the staff who, of course, thought they were leaving the iconic but exhausted Sick Kids Hospital behind. She spoke of going out the back of the hospital to a tired little porta cabin where staff and visitors could get a snack. It just felt really sad, she said, a little unloved. The porta cabin was makeshift, I was surprised it was there in the first place, but I can't imagine what state it will be in if it has to serve that purpose for another year. But it's not just about porta cabins where we have to have snacks. It's about the hospital environment more generally. And Monica Lennon made the point that we really need to understand what investment is going to occur so that this hospital is made safe and attractive and a place where people's morale is uplifted for the time that they have to spend there. There is a great human cost here. There's stress, there's additional travel, working and being treated in an environment which doesn't meet current requirements and expectations. Staff have moved closer to where they thought their new place of work was going to be. And how much are we paying for all of this? Audit Scotland tells us that the contractual issues alone add an extra £90 million to the cost for NHS Lothian. And currently, my constituents and all those who use this highly regarded hospital are asking for answers. Of course they are. NHS Lothian took over the building from IHSL, the private consortium which built it, in February this year. Since then, we've been paying this consortium some £1.4 million a month for a hospital which can't be used. This isn't in the public interest. With the Queen Elizabeth Hospital and the Royal Hospital for Sick Children, we have two flagship hospitals where at least part of the construction is simply not fit for purpose. The human costs are immense. Uncertainty and unplanned children for very sick children and their families, staff working in buildings that are well past their sell-by date. And meanwhile, who's benefiting? Some offshore account. I welcome the fact that the Cabinet Secretary's amendment today states that it would be the right thing to increase confidence by establishing a public inquiry, given that we now understand that no one knows how on earth matters that the sick kids progressed as far as they did, all the while with a building with a model that wasn't fit for purpose, which could potentially endanger sick children. We need to get to the bottom of this. You know, I'd be grateful if the Cabinet Secretary could confirm, perhaps in closing, what we're paying that money for. What is that money being paid for every month? What for exactly? The original building costs of the sick kids were £150 million or so, yet we're told that we could end up paying over £430 million over the next 25 years. Is that value for money when at the end of it all the public still won't own the building? It'll belong to the bankers. The Cabinet Secretary maintains that the finance model, the Scottish Government's PPP-light NPD model, plays no part in this construction fiasco, but I agree with the branch chair for the union Unison, who says this is money that should have been spent on patient care. We desperately need more money in our health service in Scotland, not less. I do hope the Cabinet Secretary will ensure that the board and all involved in trying to rectify this terrible situation as soon as possible will have the support they require. I have sympathy with the creation of the new national body, and I fully expect that we will be updated on its remit. I'm slightly concerned by the fact that an individual seems to have so much control over what that remit will be, and I'd be grateful if the Cabinet Secretary could expand on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Alec Cole-Hamilton. Mr. Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I was the first parliamentarian to call for a public inquiry on these issues, and I'm very grateful as such to see that happen today. I did so not because I wanted to stick with which to beat the government, but something to challenge the reality, or at least address the reality, that we now have a hospital in Edinburgh which has no children being treated in it currently and costing the taxpayer £1.4 million a month. That there are patients, my constituents, other people's constituents in the old hospital for sick children who are in a building well past its sell-by date, who expected to be moving, and that all of this was just uncovered 100 hours before the decant was supposed to happen. If, as the government say, and as the KPMG report suggests, that it shows that there's no specific error on the part of the Scottish Government, then they have nothing to fear in such a public inquiry. But it will give us the vital answers so that we know that infrastructure projects like this can go forward unencumbered by this kind of mistake in the future. There are three kind of things I want to address in the remainder of my time. The first is tone. I met with the BMA this morning. They made a direct appeal to me as an opposition member and says, remember, there are workers, clinicians and managers in the NHS who are involved in this project right now who do not feel safe at all, because they feel when they see headlines like about heads rolling and the rest of it that they may be in an unsafe position. I think that I am not looking for any particular scalp. I just want answers. If there is accountability to be had, then that's something for the future. But in the meantime, I want answers. The second is about sequencing. Many of the people who will have to answer questions of this public inquiry are currently involved in the delivery of the sick kids and the changes that they need to effect to that flawed building. I hope the Cabinet Secretary can give assurances that in the conduct of this inquiry, they will not be pulled offline, potentially making this delay even greater. And the final thing is the policy response of the government following this public inquiry. There may be questions, many questions, affecting the current operation of our territorial health boards, but to which none of them is the answer central government control. So while I support the creation of a central expert oversight group, I think that the principle of local health board autonomy was hard won and is something that we need to protect. So it's very important that this public inquiry delivers on all of those things. It answers the questions about the waste of public money. How was the flawed environmental matrix allowed to influence the tender document? What were the missed opportunities that the KPMG report refers to? How do we make sure those opportunities are never missed in the future and that similar flaws in guidance documents around tenders do not lead to this kind of morass in the future? And then the lessons learned are applied consistently across our 14 territorial health boards, and that we resist the urge to take control. Because with respect, and this is not in any way hoping to denigrate the tone that I've sought to establish in my remarks, this government hasn't got the best record at delivering massive infrastructure projects itself. And I point to a rather large one in my own constituency, which might not yet be finished. Nevertheless, Presiding Officer, I am very grateful to the Scottish Government for listening to opposition members in our unanimous calls for a public inquiry. The Liberal Democrats will support all amendments before this chamber today, and I go forward with the confidence that the Cabinet Secretary extended to me in her opening remarks when responding to my intervention, that this judge-led inquiry will go where the evidence takes it. There will be no precondition on what it is allowed to look at, and if it is found that this government has anything to account for, that it will come to this chamber and recognise that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Open debate, 4-minute speeches with a little time in hand for interventions. Michelle Ballantyne, followed by George Adam. Miss Ballantyne, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Who is to blame? Who will be the government's fall guy? When will this mess be sorted out? Questions I have been repeatedly asked as the fiasco of the Edinburgh Children's and Young People's Hospital has reverberated around the headlines. Then yesterday we were told there will be a public inquiry at the expense of the public purse. Hot on the heels of the Cabinet Secretary making it clear last Wednesday that she thought a public inquiry would serve no purpose. Perhaps if I was a cynic, I might think that the First Minister thought differently as she dealt with calls for heads to roll, or perhaps the Cabinet Secretary was advised that it would buy her time to deflect questions by pointing to the forthcoming inquiry. There will, of course, be questions asked in this inquiry, technical documents sifted and examined, and no doubt conclusions of mismanagement and miscommunication. But the real question may well remain: who is ultimately responsible? Was political pressure brought to bear to cut corners and speed up the build? And who should have realised that there was a problem and intervened to correct it? Not I, says the Cabinet Secretary. I did not know. Nobody told me there were problems. My department was only responsible for funding it and checking that the budget was okay. And I am as appalled as everyone else, and I have acted quickly to resolve it. Meanwhile, the staff, parents and children who work at or depend on the hospital could be forgiven for thinking that the Cabinet Secretary's interest and outrage is a little late, as they unpack their boxes and are faced with another year or more in a hospital that is no longer fit for purpose. They are right to be asking why the government is acting like it had no responsibility for this fiasco, as they struggle with ageing or non-functioning equipment that they were not allowed to replace because there was a newly equipped hospital on the horizon. And claims that the Cabinet Secretary and her government were unaware of any potential problems look trite when we read in the KPMG report that there were lots of meetings and exchanges of information. The problem, it says, was human error and misinterpretation of the standards at the outset of the tender. After the problems with the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Glasgow, surely any competent government would have immediately sought independent reassurance from the Edinburgh Children's Hospital build that it was going to meet all the required standards, particularly as it was using the same basic design and same contractor. Lessons will and have been learnt, we were told. Surely the key lesson was to learn was to check, double check and triple check the specification of the ventilation systems at the very least, and other key health and safety areas in any new build before you sign it off. The Cabinet Secretary says she didn't know where there were problems until the 2nd of July. Well, I say it was your job to know. You were asked time and time again in this chamber alone about the build. That in itself should have heightened your nerves and ensured you sought robust assurances. Yep.
Annabel Ewing.
I'm grateful to the member for taking intervention. The KPMG report identified that the key issue that led to the delay of the opening 9th July was the tender specification that was incorrect. Would it not be actually for NHS Lothian as the contracting authority to take responsibility for its own tender document?
Michelle Ballantyne.
NHS Lothian clearly also have a responsibility, but my point here is that government, in the light of the Queen Elizabeth debacle, should have had heightened responses to any problems. Well, whilst I'm running out of time, whilst I'm glad that the Cabinet Secretary made the decision not to open, it was the right thing to do in the circumstances. And I actually welcome the proposition to create a robust, experienced board to lead on future builds, but I do echo some of the concerns that Alex Cole-Hamilton gave. My point here is if you really did not know that the Edinburgh Children's Hospital had design flaws until a few days before it was due to open, we and the electorate have to ask, was this incompetence? Did the Cabinet Secretary not bother to ask, check or ensure that this build was to the correct standards? Or was it naivety and a failure to recognise risk? And in the words I hear so often in this chamber, a refusal to take lessons from anyone else. Either way, the Cabinet Secretary's primary focus now seems to be finding someone to take the fall so that the government can say they have dealt with it.
Thank you. I call George Adam to be followed by Anna Sarwar. Mr Adam, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As we don't have much time in this debate, I'll get to the main points right away. And first and foremost, the safety of patients and their families is the most important part of this debate. And I think that's something we can all agree on. But some of the hyperbole I've heard from Miles Briggs is quite concerning, because when you talk about the responsibility is two-way as well, and we should find this out from the public inquiry, is the fact that the Health Board does have a responsibility to this. This is not passing the blame on to someone else. They were the main drivers in the actual programme of delivering that building. So we have to actually take that into consideration. I need to make some movement because we've only got 4 minutes. I'm pleased that the Scottish Government recognises the need to strengthen quality and control and planning of healthcare buildings, since the most important people, as I've already said, are those involved. And it's also extremely important that this type of situation doesn't arise again. The fact that NHS Lothian has been escalated to level 4 on the escalation framework shows that the Scottish Government are looking to provide confidence, and the action plan for the new hospital in Edinburgh will be delivered. There's also been issues ongoing with Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Greater Glasgow and Clyde area, and I welcome that they too will be part of this public inquiry. But the Cabinet Secretary is correct when she says she has listened to the parents of children in both areas regarding their concerns and came to her decision on a public inquiry. This is about patient safety, and that's paramount. And that's why the Scottish Government announced in the programme for government that they will establish this new national body which will have oversight in design, construction and maintenance of major infrastructure developments within our NHS. It's my own personal opinion that the management of these projects by both health boards has not met the mark. They've been found wanting in these very important projects. But we need to ensure that this does not happen again, and perhaps the inquiry will tell us this. We're all quite rightly proud about our NHS and all the work that those involved do, and I appreciate the debate can become heated due to the passion that we all have for this key part of our society. But, Presiding Officer, I've been involved in politics and the process for a long time. I know how passionate everyone can, but we should never, ever politically weaponise the NHS like this. It is far too important for that type of petty politicking. But unfortunately, that is what some of the opposition have done here both in this chamber.
Excuse me,
and
Mr. Adam, I can't hear you.
No problem.
If you just let me hear Mr. Adam, please.
Okay.
Are you taking intervention or not?
No, I
Mr.
am
Adam?
not. I've only
right,
got
thank
4
you.
minutes.
I'd like to hear Mr. Adams has
I've
to
only
say.
got
I'd
4
like to hear
minutes,
everybody else.
Presiding Officer.
Sorry, don't speak over me, Mr. Adam. Now continue.
So, when we look at the situation, have there been issues with these projects? Yes, there has. Should we do something about it? Of course we should. Has the Cabinet Secretary taken on board the views expressed and taken action? Yes, she has. You know, I read recently that Miles Briggs believes that the NHS was becoming too politicised. I agree with him, and I'd offer him one bit of advice. Stop it. Stop politicising our NHS. From these back benches, I have watched a Cabinet Secretary provide a plan to try and find a solution. A Cabinet Secretary willing to engage with anyone involved, including the opposition members. While at the same time, I have not seen any Tory members ask about the responsibilities of senior members of the Health Board. I would ask Tory MSPs to stop using our NHS as a way to promote themselves. Anyone would think there was a Westminster election coming up. Oh wait, there is. And that's the part of this debate that churns my stomach. We have a situation in both projects that should never have happened, and we need to find out how this all came about. That's why the public inquiry is important, and the wishes of the families should be respected. I have family members and friends who work within the NHS, and they are sick of their workplace being dragged through the political mire by opposition parties. Presiding Officer, I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's plan on this issue and have confidence in their ability to sort it. Trying to solve a problem is a lot more difficult, and it takes cool heads and some thoughtful considerations. It's time for the opposition to get away from their petty form of party politicking, and we need to get on with the problem that's in front of us and continue delivering for the people of Scotland.
Thank you. I call Anna Sarwar to be followed by Kenneth Gibson. Mr. Sarwar, please.
Presiding Officer, this debate is not about politics. It's not even about management decisions. Patients have died at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital because of infection control issues. And I think members across this chamber would do well to remember that, including 2 babies who died because of pigeon dropping infections. That's what this debate is about, not elections and not about politics. Because we have seen a series of scandals at the Queen Elizabeth. Ventilation issues, contaminated water, leaks, mould, fungal problems, falling panels, sewage leaks at the main entrance, sewage leaks in the operating theatres, and it's impacted on patients. Wards closed, patients and children dying, kids sent home, kids sent to hospices to get washed, delayed chemotherapy, impact on staff, staff overstretched, overworked, some breaking down in tears because of the pressure put on them, and the impact on the public with confidence shattered in that state-of-the-art hospital and in our wider National Health Service. That's what this discussion and debate is about. And that means there have been clear failures of leadership, both at a local and national level. I welcome the public inquiry, but I think the public deserves certain reassurances. This inquiry must include looking at the first planning decisions, the building, the procurement, construction, installation, the commissioning, the handover, the maintenance, the operational management and organisational behaviour of the Health Board and NHS Scotland more widely. I want to just focus on the Health Board for a moment. They had oversight of this project, they signed off on this project, but what I have to ask is why weren't infection control experts at the heart of this project? How much has been spent on remedial work that could have been spent on patient care? Now, I've had worrying information shared with me from whistleblowers at the Queen Elizabeth that there's also not been accuracy from the Health Board. For example, the Health Board has said that there were only 22 reported infections at the Ward 2A at the Children's Hospital, when in actual fact there were 40 cases of infection. And then when the HPS did investigate, they only looked at the 2017 cases and not looked at the 2016 cases. I've also got worrying insight about whistleblowers identifying problems while the hospital was being built, after it was opened, and ever since. And they weren't listened to and were forced to whistleblow in September 2017. They were intimidated, they were bullied, and they were silenced, leading to 2 resignations of infection control experts at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. And what's the role of ministers? I accept that many of these issues happened before the Cabinet Secretary came into post, but this was still her government. But I do have 2 criticisms of the Cabinet Secretary. The first, that when she rightly announced the review into the disasters at the Queen Elizabeth, why did it take 6 months for that review to set its terms of reference, to pick its appointees in terms of who was controlling the review, and to start the investigation? So much could have been learnt in that 6 months. That was 6 months lost. And secondly, why did we not learn the lessons of the Queen Elizabeth for the Children's Hospital in Edinburgh? The Cabinet Secretary says that she didn't know about the issues until the 2nd of July. Well, in actual fact, if she had listened to the whistleblowers at the Queen Elizabeth who had an interest and an insight into what was happening in Edinburgh, she would have known well in advance. If she had bothered to read the evidence that went to the Health and Sport Committee into their inquiry in February, where one anonymous submission from an infection control expert actually says inadequate ventilation systems have been installed in new hospitals, but these are not fit for purpose for the specialist patient groups they are intended. In February, if anyone had bothered to read the anonymous submissions from infection control experts in February, not waiting until July. So all these issues must be looked into. I realise I'm short for time, so just in closing, I think it's important that those that are involved in this inquiry are the right people. It cannot be people who were involved in the decision-making process for the building specification, for the commissioning. It can't be those people involved directly with addressing the problems and the issues, and it can't be those people that are now dealing with the outbreaks and the infections. It has to be genuinely independent. Otherwise, there will be accusations of whitewash from the Health Board and whitewash from this government.
Thank you, Mr Sarwar. I have no time in hand now, I warn you. I have Kenneth Gibson, followed by Annie Wells.
Officer, and let me first debunk the notion that the SNP has difficulty delivering hospital projects. The £54.8 million acute mental health in North Ayrshire Community Hospital, Battle Woodlands View, opened in 2016, serves up to 206 inpatients, centralises adult mental health and addiction inpatient services on one site, improves rehabilitation and re-enablement services, and provides additional outpatient and support services. And other examples are the £275.5 million Dumfries and Galloway Hospital and the new £110 million Emergency Care Centre in Aberdeen. Regarding Edinburgh Royal Children's Hospital, my thoughts are with the families awaiting this new facility, in which the SNP government has invested £150 million and which the Health Secretary is rightly holding to the high standards of patient safety, even if that means delay. Again, as patient safety is paramount, I support a national body to oversee major NHS infrastructure developments and welcome this constructive suggestion. I'd be happy to take an intervention if I'm getting the time back, Presiding Officer. I cannot, so I do apologise to the member. It was known at the outset that NHS Lothian would invest £80 million in enabling works to prepare the site, and this was factored into the decision to proceed. Such costs were included in the full business case and in regular updates to the Scottish Government's infrastructure investment plan. Learning from previous experience is crucial, and I welcome that back in January, the Health Secretary commissioned an independent review of the QEUH building's design, commissioning, construction, handover and ongoing maintenance, and how these contribute to effective infection control. I also welcome the public inquiry into these two projects announced yesterday. Is it disappointing to have a one-year delay in delivering Edinburgh Royal Children's Hospital and go over budget on the £150 million investment? Yes. Should questions be asked of the Health Board and contractor as to why issues identified in 2012 were not communicated to ministers until earlier this year? Absolutely. Should we put the inconvenience of the hospital opening in 2020 instead of 2029 in perspective and considering the magnitude of the project, the initial project cost, and again, patient safety? Obviously. But for the Tories, they should get their own house in order. Only today, their Prime Minister, to whom they are slavishly devoted, unlike many of their more robust Westminster colleagues, was castigated by the father of a sick child on a visit to a London hospital, who said this very day, "There are not enough doctors, there are not enough nurses, the NHS is being destroyed, and now you come here for a press opportunity." This after 9 years of UK Tory government. Meanwhile, the backlog of repairs in England for hospitals already open is a shocking £6 billion. As the Independent reported, £3 billion of that is required for conditions presenting significant risk to patients and staff. We're talking about a blocked toilet in Yorkshire leading to, and I quote, faeces coming through the floor in the ultrasound department for weeks. A Midlands maternity hospital where a leaking roof led to equipment and electrical fittings being soaked, damaged and hazardous. A labour ward too cold to safely care for babies. Because of their obsession with austerity, the Tories deprived their health infrastructure of so much funding that some hospital buildings in England are literally falling apart, and the consequences affect us. Some 76 out of 170 hospital trusts declare
can
a clinical
I ask you,
service
Mr
incident
Gibson, to return to the government amendment, please?
in 2018-19. As a result of these Dickensian infrastructure conditions. So instead of lecturing the Health Secretary, it is their own government they should tear into. They shouldn't lecture this government. The Conservatives should look in the mirror and let the SNP, the only party fit to govern, get on with it. And as for Labour, they disregarded 81 requests for a public inquiry into mid-Staffordshire NHS trusts for 2 years when 1,200 excess deaths were caused. So this government is working hard, it's doing its best, it's doing an excellent job relative to the other two parties who could only have presided over ever more disastrous conditions in our NHS should they be in power.
Thank you. I call Annie Wells to be followed by Annabel Ewing, who will be the last speaker in the open debate. Ms Wells, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I don't think it will come as much of a surprise that today I will be focusing on the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, a hospital that in the last year has been plagued with a catalogue of problems that show no sign of stopping. What I want to put on record before I go any further is that my remarks today are in no way a criticism of the amazing work staff do day to day, caring for patients at the hospital and making sure their needs are met. What I want to stress today is that the SNP government, which has now agreed to a public inquiry, needs to conduct it with the pace and urgency it warrants. Opening in July 2015 and costing nearly £850 million to build, the Queen Elizabeth was once hailed as a flagship hospital. Fast forward 5 years, and we are seeing crisis after crisis in large put down to the hospital's construction history, design and fabric. Last year, a number of children in the adjoining Royal Hospital for Children were affected by bacteria in the water supply, resulting in an incident management team being set up. Earlier in the year, it shockingly emerged that 2 patients had sadly died after contracting an infection caused by pigeon droppings at the hospital. In August, 3 children were struck down with infections while being treated for cancer. And only this weekend, the Herald revealed a number of issues with the site, including concerns about a ventilation system, missing or inaccurate record keeping, and wards which were not built for purpose. And as a result, we are now seeing children being forced to travel to Aberdeen for crucial care, including for chemotherapy, the absolute tip of the iceberg for patients in Scotland. It's hard to overestimate just how serious these issues are, as demonstrated by the strength of feeling of parents speaking out on behalf of their children. I know from constituents, having raised their concerns directly with me, that patients are worried that they are putting themselves at risk. People are genuinely considering whether it's safe to walk through its doors. I absolutely appreciate that an independent review is underway and that the Health Secretary yesterday confirmed a public inquiry will take place. However, patients are yet to see the sense of urgency you'd expect given the circumstances or the leadership required to fix the hospital's systematic problems. It was reported over the summer that the investigation into the hospital may not conclude for another 18 months. Today, many will be asking just why it's taken so long for the Health Secretary to agree to a public inquiry and why it's only upon hearing the heartbreaking stories of patients and their families that she agreed to do so, when in fact, as we've heard, only last week she stated she did not see what difference a public inquiry would make. The public now needs to see the Scottish Government is committed to conducting the inquiry as soon as possible and that lessons will be learnt for all future hospital projects. That is also why today we have called for the remit of the new national body with oversight of major infrastructure developments within the NHS to be published no later than December this year. We cannot afford to see any more issues relating to hospitals' design and construction. To finish today, Deputy Presiding Officer, I'd like to reaffirm my support for our party's motion. We need to hear from the Health Secretary not just what will happen in the next year or so, but exactly what action will be taken in the coming days and weeks. Only by doing so will public confidence be restored in our hospitals.
Thank you very much. I call Annabel Ewing, then we move to closing speeches. Ms Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to be called to speak in this debate this afternoon, and given my constituency interest as the MSP for Cowdenbeath constituency, I will focus my remarks in the brief time available on the issue of the new Sick Kids Hospital in Edinburgh. And I would like to stress at the outset that, of course, patient safety must always be the paramount consideration in our National Health Service. And that is what is being delivered day in and day out. At the existing Sick Kids Hospital, children are receiving the best treatment from our excellent NHS staff, and that is widely recognised. And, Presiding Officer, I think it is very important indeed that we stress for any anxious parent listening that when talking about a delay in the opening of the new hospital premises, we stress that no child is being denied any care. Rather, they are in fact receiving the care that they need, and that to the highest standard. Turning to the decision to delay the opening of the new Sick Kids Hospital in Edinburgh, I think it is important, Presiding Officer, to ensure that the facts are indeed put on the record this afternoon in this debate, both as to the issue of the timing of the decision and also as to the substantive reasons involved. And, Presiding Officer, it could not be clearer from the KPMG report at page 10, paragraph 2.2, that the issue of the ventilation problem was brought to the attention of NHS Lothian Board, in fact, on 1 July 2019. The Health Secretary was advised. I would take a very brief intervention because I only have 4 minutes.
Daniel Johnson.
There were 4 missed opportunities, and it first looked into those issues in July 2017.
Annabel Ewing.
I think the member will find that that issue was in relation to whether or not the technical specification error should have been discovered. But KPMG is quite clear about its conclusion, and I refer the member to that again. The Health Secretary was advised on 2nd July and therefore acted entirely properly and with all due speed in announcing on 4th July her decision to delay the opening of the new hospital, and she acted timelessly in setting in train the actions required to rectify the problem. Turning to the substantive issues involved, it is, as I have said, also clear from the KPMG report that the problem leading to the decision to delay, and which was intimated to NHS Lothian Board on 1 July 2019, involved an error in the tender specification. Specifically, the environmental matrix, which formed part of the tender documentation, contained elements which were inconsistent with the Scottish Health Technical Memoranda 03/01 as far as air change rates were concerned in some of the critical care areas of the new hospital. This error was embedded in the tender documentation and was subsequently carried over into the implementation of the contract. This then begs the question as to why this error was not picked up. And, Presiding Officer, as I have already said in an intervention, it is difficult to see at this stage how ultimate responsibility could lie other than with NHS Lothian. They were the contracting authority. This was their tender document. The statutory public inquiry that the Health Secretary has announced is therefore very welcome indeed, for we must understand what happened with this building project and ensure that it does not happen again. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, as I said at the outset, patient safety is the paramount consideration in all our hospitals, and that should be the foremost consideration in each of our minds today. I hope that the public inquiry proceeds apace, but I hope too that it does not impinge in any way on the speedy rectification of the technical issues identified at both the new Edinburgh Sick Kids and at the QEUH in Glasgow. And in that regard, I take this opportunity to commend the Health Secretary for listening to the views of the families affected and for acting decisively in response. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Ms Ewing. I call Daniel Johnson to close for Labour. 4 minutes, please, Mr.
Thank
Johnson.
you, Presiding Officer. We need a new children's hospital in Edinburgh. The Sick Kids is a cherished institution in my constituency, but it has suffered from years of make, do and mend, based on promises of a new building that have gone on for years, if not decades. And Miles Briggs at the beginning of this debate was absolutely right. Parents are angry, and I'm sorry if George Adam, who's no longer in his chair, thinks that's a petty point. It's not a petty point. It's a personal point, because I am one of those parents. My daughter spent 4 months in the sick kids, and I know how compromised that building is and how badly a new one is needed. And that is why we need an inquiry. So we should welcome the KPMG report. It is a useful document that tells us what happened, that a contractor relied on a document supplied by the Health Board that contained an error, but that subsequently that £16 million typo that they made, that the Health Board subsequently regarded that document as not being theirs. That had a consequence of rooms being built with a substandard ventilation, 4 cycles per hour rather than the 10, compounded by the fact that those same rooms were 4 bedrooms, which was either by oversight or miscategorisation not realised. So the question then is, how did this happen? Could or should this have been spotted? The KPMG report is also clear on that there were 4 opportunities that could have taken place. Now, if we listen to the official version, the version we've just heard, that the board didn't know till June, that the Scottish Government didn't know till July, 100 hours before that new hospital was due to open. But that is not true. Back in July 2017, it became clear that the hospital had not opened on time with 3 issues, including ventilation. That is directly from the report, 2 years before the decision was ultimately made. So what was known and when? I'm afraid I don't have time right now, but maybe after this. In July 2017, a paper went to the programme board, which the Scottish Government had a seat, following discussions with the clinical teams, that involved the ventilation to those rooms. Through 2018, workshops were held with clinical teams. And at the end of all of this, in February of this year, the agreed resolution at a cost of £12 million was arrived at, of which item 7 specifically mentions ventilation in 4 bedrooms, 4 of which were in critical care. So we now know what was known, but who knew that? And the reality is that clinical management team included, and I quote, a director, an associate medical director, a nurse director, and ultimately that agreement was signed by the board. So that was a decision. Those were discussions which included board members and went to a programme board which included someone from the Scottish Government. The reality is they knew that there were issues with ventilation, they knew that those issues impacted 4 bedrooms, and they failed to join those dots. And what's more, the Scottish Government knew that too because they had a seat at the table. It is not good enough to simply say that they did not know, because they should have known. Because it is not good enough for them to say that they weren't always in attendance at those meetings, or that they weren't experts, because the information was there if they chose to interrogate it. But the reality is that even if you accept those points, there were at least 3 key missed opportunities by the government, because the reality is the issues at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital were known about. There were issues to do with ventilation in a hospital built by the same contractor. Surely that was a red flag. Or maybe in the autumn, before the hospital was due to open, with hot water flooding into the basements, maybe then ministers should have woken up and thought to ask questions about how this hospital had been constructed. Or maybe at the point that an agreement was being signed, of which they particularly specified in particular that there were ventilation issues at a cost of £12 million, maybe then the government should have sat up and taken responsibility and asked what is going on at the hospital. That is what now needs to happen with this public inquiry, and ultimately ministers need to take responsibilities for the conclusions it arrives at.
Thank you, Mr Johnson. And now call on Jean Freeman to close for the Government Cabinet Secretary. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. In closing, I will attempt to address some of the issues and questions that have been raised. Let me start with the public inquiry and whether or not it will be restricted in its nature. Let me repeat, it is a statutory public inquiry. And the nature of a statutory public inquiry is that the chair of that public inquiry will have some say in terms of its remit. I think Mr Sarwar very helpfully set out the range of issues that it should cover. I take on board all of those issues that it should cover, and that of course does include the role of Scottish Government and the relationship between national government and our health boards up until now in terms of how infrastructure projects are taken forward. I was asked about the investment, to be sure about the investment to upgrade the current hospital last week. I gave a total figure of the anticipated additional costs for the work to be done, both in the to rectify the mistakes and correct issues in the new site, and also maintenance and improvements in the existing sites. That breaks down to, comes to just over £60 million. I believe we've issued that to Mr Johnston. But in terms of maintaining existing sites, there is additional maintenance for both of £2 million, additional equipment and other matters for both of them that run to about 3.7 million. The other numbers come with respect to the work that needs to be done in the new site, as well as areas of advice in terms of technical issues and legal issues. Can I make the point about ventilation in 2017 that Mr Johnson just finished on there? That was in fact part of the settlement agreement. It was an additional issue, yes, to the ventilation issue that came to my attention on the 2nd of July and that caused me to halt the move. Of course, all of these matters are all of these matters are met. Mr Johnson, please don't shout at me, right? Just, right, so
I'm afraid you're blaming Mr Johnson for Mr Finlay.
Well,
I don't think
I should have known it was
happy.
Mr Finlay as well.
Mr Johnson.
Would the Minister accept the point that agreement did include the 4 bedrooms, 4 of which were in critical care?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, that is my understanding, but not the overall critical care unit. Now, we can go back and forward on this, Mr Johnson. I'm not trying to hide anything. Let me assure Ms Ballantyne, I'm not looking for heads to roll, although I have a bit of a funny feeling that maybe some members from their comments are looking for my head to roll. But let me say very clearly, that all of those issues will be examined in the public inquiry. And the remit of that public inquiry will cover the areas that Mr Sarwar outlined, and I will come back to this chamber with all of that detail. I was asked about... No, I can't. I'm sorry. I've only got 2 minutes left. In terms of sequencing, Mr Cole-Hamilton and Ms Ewing both expressed concern that the public inquiry did not throw off track the work that was necessary to get the new site ready in the time frame that I gave out last week. I am very clear and assured now, and I will have very clear oversight of this, that it will not do that. That will not hold up the creation of the public inquiry, but the focus also has to be alongside that, making sure that the work that needs done in order to secure the move to the new site safely is undertaken. Just a small point on the Queen Elizabeth review. It's not entirely accurate to say that that review and the review team, the 2 co-chairs, took 6 months, and in that 6 months they were doing nothing. They were reviewing evidence, they were talking to people, and they now move to the formal process where they take verbal evidence. So they have been working to try and understand a range of complexities. Of course, what they do and what they conclude will inform the public inquiry. And finally, Presiding Officer, I want to thank all the staff involved, not just at Queen Elizabeth, but also at the Sick Kids and the DCN in Edinburgh. They, as everyone has said before me, deliver the highest possible quality of care. They do that every single day, and it is entirely wrong that their work is diminished in any way by buildings that are not fit for purpose. I think the public inquiry, but I also think the moves that we are making to change the relationships between local health boards and the responsibilities that they have and what government does in creating the new national body is entirely the right thing to do, and I will ensure that this chamber and individual members are kept up to date with all the progress that we make in all of this.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Brian Whittle to close the Conservatives. 6 minutes, please, Mr Whittle.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start by asking why it is, Deputy Presiding Officer, whenever there is a crisis such as the continuing mismanagement of key NHS hospital construction projects, it is left to the opposition to drag the Scottish Government into this chamber and force them to answer? It's never done in government time. Avoidance and deflection seems to be the priority. And if you want any evidence of that, all you needed to do was listen to how George Adam and Kenny Gibson managed to humiliate their front bench. And I have to say to Kenny Gibson, for your information, health has devolved and has been devolved to this Parliament for 20 years. It is your government's responsibility. Making mistakes is part of life. Making the same mistakes, especially given the seriousness of the consequences in this case, is unforgivable. So we had the crisis at the Queen Elizabeth, and then we have the situation at the Edinburgh Sick Children's Hospital, and it's been done by the same contractor. And the question's been asked several times in this chamber, who is accountable? And I have to say, at the weekend, I spent some time speaking with a senior clinician from the QE hospital, and they actually suggested to me that there are problems that are being covered up. They explained to me there's a cancer patient, while in remission then gets the news that their cancer has returned and they will need further treatment, only to find out that they can't have this treatment because they have fallen victim to the same infection that have affected so many others in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital. So where does patient and staff confidence now sit, as Miles Briggs suggested? Where does that sit, Cabinet Secretary? I've got to say, while you dithered, public confidence went through the floor. And now, at long last, we have the announcement of a public inquiry. Now, we're talking about here whistleblowing and a senior clinician being told to stay, just give me 2 seconds, told to stay quiet. Now, given that all the work that's been done in whistleblowing in this Parliament and how bullying has been raised in this Parliament over and over again, how can we be sure that there's an ability to share information and learn from those mistakes? Told to stay quiet. And Anna Sawa, which I thought was a very good speech, suggested that in a planning phase, especially in ventilation and water supply, surely infection control experts would be a prerequisite. Apparently not. Apparently not. That same contractor making similar mistakes in the Sick Children's Hospital in Edinburgh as was made in Glasgow. Lessons, no lessons are being learned here. There's no opportunity to learn lessons. I think we have to accept there is a fundamental issue in public procurement in capital projects. Now, it's true to say, Jean, I'll take an intervention.
Emma Harper.
You mentioned the contractors and looking at the construction. I mean, would the member agree that maybe we should look at the fact that the brand new hospital in Dumfries and Galloway, £200 million hospital, was on time and in budget? So, and that was something that maybe we should consider as well, and that was the Scottish Government project as well.
Before I call you, you corrected yourself. Please don't use the term you. You've done it, and you've done it, and I can use it, but you've not to use it. Okay, thank you, Mr. Whittle.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Now, today we've had 5 hospitals that have been mentioned. 2 out of 5 is not a good hit rate, I have to say. Now, I would say Jane Freeman did inherit much of these problems, and as such, it would be crass to try and lay the blame for these catastrophes at her feet. That responsibility has to lie with previous health secretaries, including Nicola Sturgeon. So I think it was important to give the Cabinet Secretary the space to formulate a response. However, the responses or lack thereof are most definitely her responsibility. Now, one could suggest that making the announcement of an independent inquiry the day before the issues to be debated in Parliament is a cynical attempt to deflect criticism, especially given that members from across this chamber have been calling for an inquiry for some time. And also, as Miles Briggs highlighted and others, the Cabinet Secretary dismissed a call for an inquiry just last week. If one was really cynical, one may suggest that the Scottish Government was scrambling to avoid any bad publicity on a day such as this. KPMG report highlighted Daniel Johnson listed. There have been so many opportunities to intervene in this crisis in the QE hospital in Glasgow and in the Edinburgh Sick Children's. That restorative action never happened. How many times prior to this date has the Sick Children's Hospital in Edinburgh could the Scottish Government have stepped in? Surely proper scrutiny by the Government would have recognised there was such a serious issue. Who is accountable? Because somebody has to be. Michelle Ballantyne said that, and Alex Cole-Hamilton asked, is the Scottish Government prepared to accept whatever that inquiry uncovers? Because this inquiry cannot be a ploy for the Scottish Government to buy time while it scrambles for answers. I can assure you, for the sake of patients and staff, we will not allow that to happen. Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Whittle. That concludes the debate on mismanagement of NHS construction projects. It's time to move on to the next item of business. Short pause while the front benches take their places.